I have here in front of me three different cameras from Leica. The first one is the brand new Leica Q2 Monochrom. The second one is the Leica Q2 with its classical color sensor. Both cameras have a 47 megapixel resolution. And here is the Leica M10 Monochrom, which is also kind of new, just came to market somewhere this year. And in this video I want to focus on the Q2 Monochrom and the M10 Monochrom, and will point out the various differences, and depending on what application you have in mind, depending on what type of shooter you are, the Q2 Monochrom or the M10 Monochrom might be the better choice for you. So I'm going to look into the various differences. I might want to point back to the Q2 for reference from time to time, that's why it's here on the table, but in general I hope my comparison can help you to decide whether you are more a Q2 mono shooter or an M10 mono shooter. Let's kick off the video. Let's look at dimensions first. So I dismounted now from the Leica Q2 Mono my hand grip here. I don't think we need that for this comparison. And now if you look at these cameras from a dimension perspective, they look pretty much the same. They have kind of the same size. They both fall into the category of compact cameras. And they are also both minimalistic. They both have a joystick wheel here and a push button. They both have 3 buttons at the side here. That's all consistent. They both have, kind of in the same place, the shutter speed dial here. Here we have it on the Leica Q2 Mono. They have an on-off switch, which is here for the M10 Mono and is here for the Q2 Mono. And that wheel, which is here integrated in the body and can control and steer parameters, that wheel is here also integrated in the body. And you also have a button on top, which I use for my ISO. The ISO on the M10 Mono here is on that wheel. You lift that up, and then you can steer your ISO. Here is an automatic mode, and then you start with an ISO of 160. And that's basically, from an outside perspective, the main comparison, which concludes that the dimensions of these cameras, the minimalistic appearance, the way they are designed, is very much comparable. Looking at the cameras from the front side reveals one more difference here, and that's a button here. That button here on the Leica M10 Mono is used for long exposure settings. I illustrated this in various videos on my channel, but the main difference looking at the cameras from the front side are the lenses. And the Leica Q2 Mono has a prime lens, fixed mounted, you cannot remove it or replace it, 28mm Summilux, widest open aperture f1.7, and it's an aspherical lens. And on the M10 Mono, and that's the first big difference we have here, you basically are looking at the system camera. So you have access to the full range of Leica M series lenses and also Leica R lenses, and also all kinds of other lenses which you can mount on that camera body, which gives you the full flex on focal length, on the way how fast the lenses you're using, and in general provides a much wider universe of potential options you can do with that camera here. Staying for a moment with lenses, on the M10 series cameras here, or in general on the M series cameras, you can go for macro shootings and close-ups with the macro adapter from Leica. And that is something which is built in on the Leica Q2. So you have here in the lens an option to shift, see this here, to macro, and then your scale here on your focus ring is changing accordingly to more close-up distances, and that is something which is built into the lens. And another difference, which is also I think important to notice, M series cameras, and also in particular the M10P, the M10R, the M10 Mono, they are very robust, and there are people reporting in the internet what happened to these cameras, and they were still fully operational and functional. So these cameras and lenses are very robust, but not officially weather sealed. The Leica Q2 and the Leica Q2 Monochrom, they are officially declared to be weather sealed, means dust and splash waterproof, and that is something you do not have officially on Leica M series cameras. Having said that, I was never concerned shooting these cameras under more difficult conditions. Covering quickly the sensor, so on the Leica Q2 Monochrom, you have basically the sensor from the Leica Q2, which we know for quite a while. There are lots of videos on the classical Leica Q2 on my channel, and it's the same sensor. It's just that they removed the color or Bayer filter as it is called, and then you have a pure monochrome sensor. On the Leica M10 monochrome, you have a 40 megapixel sensor and is the same resolution what you have in the M10R. So kind of these cameras are very much related. You have the Q2 Mono and the Q2 with 47 megapixels. You have the M10 Mono and the M10R with 40 megapixels. There is one more point on the exterior of these cameras I want to note, and that's also a difference which is related to the nature of these camera categories. Here on the Leica Q2 Monochrom, you have an excellent electronic viewfinder, high resolution, very contrasty, very nice. And on the Leica M10 Monochrom, of course, you have the classical optical viewfinder, which is used for range finding. And you also have the frames in this system, which you can tweak with that switch here into different, let's say, perspectives or aspect ratios and image compositions. And that is something which fundamentally distinguishes these two cameras. A remarkable difference, and I think a real breakthrough in monochrome photography, is that the Leica Q2 Mono actually is good for professional videography. And if we go into the menu here and into the status screen, I can swipe and then this changes into video mode. You see this in a way that the background gets white. And if I go here into the menu and go down to video resolution, you see here a full range of options. So I can go for cinematic 4K, 24 frames per second. I have two 4K modes with 30 and 24 frames per second. I have a whole bunch of full HD or 1080p options here. And that's actually very nice. And what is special on the monochrome is you can also tweak the black and white atmosphere as this is coming across in the videos. And for that you go to video style settings. And then you have an option to tweak your contrast and sharpness. That's standard on the Q2 series. But you also have that new option which is called toning. And here you have a full range of options to actually change the black and white atmosphere of your videos and photos. And I think that's very nice. On the M10 Monochrom, you have no video mode. And Leica got rid of the video mode on the newer M series cameras quite some time ago. The only thing you can do here, actually, if you go into the menu of the camera and you go into drive mode, you have the interval option. And clearly with the interval option, you can shoot, let's say, 900 frames. And then these 900 frames with 30 frames per second can be compiled to half a minute time lapse. That's the only, let's call it, quasi video mode you have on that camera. Everything else is not possible. Clearly the fact that you have a video mode, which is a professional video mode on the Q2 Mono and not on the M10 Mono, is also due to the fact that the Q2 Mono has a very good, very well working autofocus system. And I posted a video about a week ago where I showed how this contrast autofocus system is working. And it's actually working very well on the Q2 Mono as well as on the classical Q2. And this, of course, benefits also the video mode because it keeps tracking your target. And if you are filming and shooting film, then you want to have a very good autofocus system. On the M10 Mono, of course, you talk about a classical rangefinder. And with a classical rangefinder, you do not have autofocus. So you would have to stick to manually focusing, or you would need range focusing or zone focusing and actually hope that the target which is moving is staying in that range where it stays sharp. But there is no picking up of dynamic moves of your target because you don't have an autofocus here. And that's clearly also supporting the fact that a video mode in a rangefinder doesn't make a whole lot of sense, whereas in an autofocus camera, of course, it finds its natural place. Let's now look at differences and similarities on the inner values of these two monochrome cameras. And I want to start with ISO. Both cameras are enabled to shoot up to 100,000 ISO, which is an insanely high sensitivity. I showed in videos on my channel on both cameras that images shot with 100K ISO are actually usable. They don't look too bad, and that's phenomenal and clearly related to the top-notch properties of these monochrome sensors. Where we have a difference is in the scale of the ISO on these two cameras. And the M10 Mono has a much higher granularity on the ISO scale than the Q2 Mono, because the Q2 Mono is only adjustable in full stops, where on the M10 Mono we have stops in between, which can be helpful if you want to fine-tune your image in terms of parametrization. I'm going to show that quickly. So I use this customizable button here attached to the control wheel here for ISO, and you can change this in the menu of the camera. If I push that button, I can now change my ISO values. You see this here scrolling, and it's always full stops. 100, 200, 400, 800, and so on. 1600, 3200, 6400, 12.5K, 25K, 50K and 100K. So these are full stops, and you can also not change this in the menu. If I go into the menu and go to ISO, let me just quickly go there. Also here you have full stops, 100, 50, 25K, 12.5K, 6,400, 3,200, 1,600, 800, 400, 200, 100, and then auto. So there is no way you get a higher granularity than full stops on ISO. This is different and with a higher granularity on the M10 Mono. And first of all, on the ISO dial here, if you push it up, you have automatic, you have 160, 400, 600, 1600, 3200, 6400, 12.5K. And that doesn't look like a high granularity ISO scale. But then if you go into M for manual here, you can go into the menu, and in the menu go to ISO setup. And then if we look at the range here, it's actually with a much higher granularity than just full stop. So you have 160, 200, 250, 320, 400, and so on. And it continues to the high ISO range. So you have 12.5K, 16K, 20K, 25, 32K, 40K, 50K, 64,000, 80,000 and 100,000. And you see that you have here between the full stops also the in-between stops for your ISO, which confirms that we have a higher granularity scale here on ISO than what we have on the Q2 Mono. Another minor difference on ISO is the minimum ISO value you can go for. And if I switch on the M10 Mono and go into ISO here, the lowest value we get after auto is an ISO of 160, and that's also confirmed here on the scale. So if I turn the ISO wheel here, 160 is the minimum value I get. And that is different, slightly different on the Q2 Mono. If we switch that on here, and there's actually something interesting going on here. So let's go first to auto, and let's bring the ISO value to auto. And what you see here is no matter what you do, how good your light is, the minimum ISO it's using in auto mode is an ISO of 200. That is different on the Leica Q2 with the color sensor, because if the light is sufficient in auto mode or semi-auto mode, it actually uses an ISO of 100, whereas on the Q2 Mono sensor it goes for an ISO of 200. And I think it is because it gives you more flex on the shutter speed if your ISO is the double value here, and it really stays at a minimum of 200. I tried this many times and is probably reflecting the even better light properties of that monochrome sensor here. But manually you can go to an ISO of 100. So here is an ISO of 100, whereas the minimum ISO on the M10 Mono is an ISO of 160. Here you can go to 100. But as I said, in auto mode, the minimum it chooses is always 200, which gives you more flex on shutter speed. Clearly you could debate now whether the base ISO, which is, I would call it the physical ISO value of the sensor, on the Q2 monochrome might be an ISO of 200, whereas on the Q1 with the color sensor it clearly is an ISO of 100. But I don't think that's true. I just think that Leica is giving you in the auto mode some additional flex on shutter speed and aperture, and automatically risking to have the ISO not at the minimum value but at an ISO of 200, because the sensor can afford to shoot at 200. And when I looked at images comparing the same scene with the same amount of light with an ISO of 100 and 200 on the Q2 monochrome, I saw no differences. So I think the 200 ISO images have the same quality, low noise, sharpness, dynamic range as if you would shoot with an ISO of 100. The next topic is also related to ISO, but related to ISO and shutter speed. And the shutter speed you have on Leica Q2 cameras as the maximum available shutter speed is a function of ISO. And Leica didn't change that for the Q2 monochrome, unfortunately. It's something I complained about for a long time, but still in the Q2 monochrome it is what it is. And I'm going to illustrate this quickly. Let's go to an ISO value of 100. And now if I go here on my shutter speed dial to 1+, which means I have now with this wheel here full control, I can go up with an ISO of 100. Watch, maybe we go into the status screen, then I think it's better. So watch this. I can go up to an exposure time of basically 2 minutes before the T mode kicks in. The T mode is not a bulb mode on Leica Q2 cameras, so it doesn't open the shutter until you hit the shutter button again. So 120 seconds with an ISO 100 is nice if you want to go for long exposures, but watch what happens if we now change the ISO value here. If I go up to 200, it's still 120 seconds. When I go to 400 ISO, it automatically takes down my exposure time to 60 seconds. And if I now go back here on the shutter speed, the T mode kicks in after 60 seconds. And also the T mode is restricted now to, let's say, give or take 62 seconds. If I further turn up my ISO here to 800, it automatically restricts my shutter speed to 30 seconds. And if I would go now and try to tweak this up, no chance. It's the T mode which will stop at 31 or 32 seconds. The same happens and continues if I go to 1600. Now it's 15 seconds. And that's becoming a critical borderline for astrophotography, because I typically shoot night sky with an ISO of 3200, and then I'm restricted to 8 seconds only. And there is nothing I can do to get the shutter open for a longer time than 8 seconds. And that's a restriction, which means your shutter speed actually is a function of ISO. If I go further up, 6400 ISO, which is still reasonable for a night sky scene or astrophotography, it's restricted to 4 seconds. After 4 seconds, T mode kicks in, and T mode will not give you more than 4 seconds because it's not a bulb mode. And that continues. If you go to 12,500, it keeps the 4 seconds, but then at 25,000 it goes to 2 seconds, 50,000 2 seconds, and at 100,000 the maximum exposure time you can get is 1 second. The function of shutter speed in dependence on ISO on the Leica M10 Mono is different to what we have on the Leica Q2 Mono. And also here, in the same way as the scale of ISO values you can choose has a higher granularity, also here that constraint of shutter speed in dependence on ISO provides you with more flex. And I'm going here to the B, which is the bulb mode on the exposure dial here. And let's first choose an ISO of 160. It's actually already in here. ISO of 160. And then there is this button here. If I push and hold this button, I get an exposure time menu. So let's do this. And now you see here, I can go up to 16 minutes of exposure time on the lowest ISO value. And it already says here, the longest exposure time depends on the current ISO setting. So here you get this warning. On the Q2, they just implemented on the classical Q2 as well as on the Q2 Monochrom, and don't tell you that in the same way as they tell it here. But it's actually plenty of space here. So if you're at ISO 160 and you can go to here up to 16 minutes, that is a long time to take exposure. Now, if we change the ISO value, and let's jump a little bit, let's go to, what did we see before? Let's go to 3200 for a night sky shooting. Sorry, that was 4000. Let's do this again. And let's bring up that menu here. I can still go up here to 60 seconds. And that's plenty of time, because for a night sky shooting, I should not go with a full frame sensor beyond 15 seconds, maybe even less. So that's plenty of space. If I go here to an ISO of 6400, which is also a typical night sky scene, I have here in that menu still 32 seconds, which is too long in order to not let the stars become little trails. So I would probably shoot this with 16 seconds or 12 seconds. So this is fine. Another difference in the inner life of these two cameras are these different black and white tonalities you can introduce in video and photo on the Q2 Monochrom, and then on still images on the M10 Mono. And I showed this before. If I go here into, let's say, JPEG settings, I have here the toning, and in the toning it gives me these options. And that's differently organized in the M10 Mono. In the M10 Mono, you go here into the menu, and then in the menu you go to the main menu, you go to JPEG settings, and then you have also toning on or off. And then you can actually here for hue and strength choose different values. So you can combine sepia blue and selenium. And on strength, you can basically say off, weak, or strong. And that is all in one menu list on the Q2 Mono, whereas here you have to go one level deeper into the menus. On the drive modes, these cameras are comparable. Let's quickly open them up both here. So let's go into drive mode. And then if we put them side by side here, you see this is kind of the same list. It's hard to hold for me. Let's look into the Q2 Mono first. You have single, continuous in various speeds here, interval shooting and exposure bracketing, which is helpful. And the same exists here on the M10 Mono, single, continuous, low and high speed. You don't have these in-between grades, and then you have interval shooting, exposure bracketing. The self-timer here is basically included in the drive mode, whereas on the Q2 Mono, I have the self-timer on this customizable button, function button here. So if I push that, I can go to off, 2 seconds or 12 seconds timer, but pretty much comparable. I think that's it. So in terms of main differences, but also similarities, I pretty much covered everything. There are lots of other things which I could mention, but they are not really breathtaking. And many of these settings here, the way you have your exposure metering, drive mode we mentioned, flash setup, all these kind of things, this is pretty much the same. You have all settings on your EVF if you mount it on the M10 Mono. Here it is built in. You can change the settings in the menu. Also on the LCD screen, you have user profiles, and you can customize some of your controls. So there are many things which are exactly the same. Both cameras can be connected to the Leica Photos app, and you can operate the camera from a smartphone remotely, which is very nice and convenient. And I think in general these cameras have a lot of common schemes, but also some fundamental differences, as I have showed them and demonstrated here on these two camera bodies. Wrapping up the video very quickly, I think given the list of features which are here and here, or not here and not here, you can probably figure out yourself what camera is for you. If you want to make a decision tree, the first thing is, do you need different lenses? If you need different lenses, that prime lens setup here with 28mm is not for you. If you need different lenses, this is one of the most versatile, most fungible camera systems in terms of available lenses in the world. Then if you want to become a monochrome shooter, the M10 Mono is your choice. If you are a video shooter, the M10 Mono is not for you. You need to go for the Q2 Mono, because here you get for the first time cinematic 4K in a very high resolution, natively shot and filmed on a black and white sensor. If you are an available light or low light shooter, then both cameras are suitable for you, because they can go up to insanely high ISO values, and as I showed in various other videos, these sensors also deliver top-notch image quality with high ISO values, and they have low noise. So both cameras are suitable for photography in low light environments. If you are annoyed about Leica's habit to constrain the maximum exposure time based on ISO, then the M10 Mono, it's much less constrained than the Q2 Mono. You have much more flexibility here, as I demonstrated in the menu when I showed you what shutter speeds you can actually choose independent of ISO. And that is much more heavily constrained on the Leica Q2 Mono than on the Leica M10 Mono. So here, maybe there is a clear argument for some of you for the M10 Mono. Thinking about resolution for a moment, I don't really see a big difference between 47 megapixels and 40 megapixels. In particular, because as demonstrated in one video which I posted some time ago, these monochrome sensors have what I call the pixels, and you can actually print them at 200 or 300% magnification without any loss of image quality. So 47 megapixels compared to 40 megapixels is not the criteria for a meaningful choice whether this or this camera is the right gadget for you. Last but not least, and that's a question of workflow, if you are used to modern DSLMs and not feel familiar in the world of rangefinder cameras, where the natural choice is an optical viewfinder here, then you have a better choice here on the Q2 Mono, because that EVF is excellent. Here you would have to buy one as an accessory. It's not really cheap, has a much worse quality than what you get on the Leica Q2. In particular, if you're a shooter who is relying on focus peaking, if the camera is close to your eye, then you probably have a better choice with the Q2 Mono, but that's probably a side argument. At the very end, it's about lenses, yes, no. It's about video, yes, no. And if you get annoyed about exposure constraints, which Leica seems to love and we users seem to hate, then I think the M10 Mono is a better choice and you should go for the M10 Mono. Last point is price or money. If we look at these cameras for, let's say, between 5,000 or 6,000 bucks, you get here a fully fledged system. You get an excellent lens. The standalone price for that lens in the Leica system probably is already 3,500 to 4,000 bucks. And here you get the camera body for a little extra. And then you have a system which is ready to go and up and running. On the Leica M10 Monochrome, it is very painful what you have to pay. The body itself is much more expensive than the whole system here. But then that's not the end. You also have to pay a lot of money for Leica M lenses. You could go for Voigtländer or for Zeiss, but in general, the M lenses perform best on the M series bodies, and it's really expensive to get these lenses. In particular, if you want to match it and want to have a 28mm lens on the M10 Mono in the same quality as you have it on the Q2 Mono, the final price tag for that camera system is very likely beyond 10K. I hope you like this comprehensive comparison of the two monochrome cameras from Leica. The image quality on both cameras is mind-blowing, the resolution difference is marginal, and you get the best what the black and white world has to offer out of these two sensors in combination with the prime lens fixed mounted on the Leica Q2 Monochrom and the rich portfolio of potential options in terms of lenses on the Leica M10 Monochrom. If you liked that video, don't forget to drop me a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching and peace out.